The woman's mule stopped dead in the middle of Main Street, just as the supply wagon behind her nearly crashed into her backside, and Eleanor Vance didn't even flinch. She sat atop that gray beast with her back straight as a lodgepole pine, one hand gripping the reins while the other shaded her eyes against the brutal June sun beating down on Grass Valley, California in the year 1872. The wagon driver cursed, his face turning red as a ripe tomato, but Eleanor simply waited for her mule to decide it was ready to move again. "That woman's got a stubborn mule for a horse," shouted old Pete from the general store porch, slapping his knee like he'd said something clever. "Stubborn woman for a stubborn animal," someone else called out, and laughter rippled down the street. Eleanor ignored them all. She'd been ignoring men's opinions since she was old enough to understand that most of them were worth about as much as fool's gold. Her mule, Daisy, would move when Daisy was good and ready, and no amount of shouting or cursing or laughing would change that fact. The animal had carried her all the way from Missouri over the past 3 months, through storms and heat and dangers Eleanor didn't care to remember in detail, and if Daisy wanted to stop and think things over in the middle of town, then that was Daisy's right. After a long minute, the mule flicked her ears forward and resumed walking, calm as Sunday morning. Eleanor guided her toward the hitching post outside the land office, dismounted with practiced ease despite her dusty skirts, and tied Daisy securely. The mule immediately closed her eyes and appeared to fall asleep standing up. The land office smelled like old paper and tobacco smoke. A thin man with spectacles looked up from his desk, took one look at Eleanor's travel-worn dress and sun-darkened face, and frowned. "Can I help you, miss? If you're looking for your husband or father, I haven't seen any gentlemen come through this morning." "I'm not looking for anyone," Eleanor said, pulling a folded document from the leather satchel she carried. "I'm here to file my land claim. I've got a quarter section staked out about 8 miles north of here, up in the foothills." The man's frown deepened. "A land claim? Miss, surely you must be confused. Women don't file homestead claims on their own. Where's your father, your husband?" "Dead," Eleanor said flatly. "Both of them. My father died 3 years ago, my husband 2 years back. I'm 23 years old, a widow, and I'm perfectly capable of filing my own claim. The Homestead Act doesn't say anything about being a man, just being the head of a household. I'm the head of my own household now." The clerk sputtered, his face going through several interesting shades of pink and red. "But miss, you can't possibly think you can work 160 acres alone. The land up in those foothills is rough country. There's barely any water, the soil's rocky, and there are bears and mountain lions and Lord knows what else up there." "Then I suppose it's fortunate that I'm planning to work it anyway," Eleanor replied, her voice sweet as honey over steel. "Now, are you going to process my claim? Or do I need to ride to Sacramento and file a complaint about a government employee refusing to do his job?" 20 minutes later, Eleanor walked out of the land office with her claim officially filed, her proof of payment tucked safely in her satchel. The clerk had processed her paperwork with ill grace, muttering under his breath about fool women who didn't know their place, but Eleanor had gotten what she came for. That was all that mattered. She untied Daisy and led the mule down the street toward the general store. She needed supplies, enough to last her at least a month while she got her cabin properly built and her garden started. The small shelter she'd thrown up when she first arrived was adequate for keeping the rain off, but it wouldn't survive a proper winter. She had 6 months to prove up her claim, and she intended to use every day of them wisely. The general store was crowded with miners and ranchers, all of them turning to stare when Eleanor walked in. She ignored the looks, just like she ignored the whispers that followed her between the shelves. Let them talk. She'd heard worse on the trail coming here. She was examining a set of hinges for her cabin door when a voice behind her said, "Those are good quality, made back east, not the local stuff." Eleanor turned to find herself looking up at a man who seemed to fill the entire aisle with his presence. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the light from the window behind him. His hair was dark brown, longer than fashionable, curling slightly at his collar. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of beard. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray as storm clouds and sharp with intelligence. "Thank you," Eleanor said, turning back to the hinges. I'll take 3 sets. Building something? The man asked. He didn't move away, and Eleanor found herself acutely aware of how much space he occupied, how the scent of pine and leather and clean sweat seemed to surround him. A cabin, she replied, keeping her voice neutral. She learned the hard way that friendly conversation with strange men often led to unwanted attention. Up in the foothills, I heard. The old Mackenzie quarter section. Eleanor turned to look at him again, this time with suspicion clear on her face. You been asking about me? Didn't have to ask. This is a small town, and news travels fast, especially news about a woman filing a homestead claim by herself. He extended a hand, and Eleanor saw that it was large and calloused, the hand of a man who worked hard for his living. Killian Lawson. I've got a place up in the mountains, about 15 miles north of here. I come down for supplies once a month or so. Eleanor hesitated, then shook his hand. His grip was firm but careful, like he was conscious of his own strength. Eleanor Vance. I know, Killian said, and something that might have been amusement flickered in his gray eyes. Like I said, small town. I also know that half the men here are betting you won't last a month up in those foothills. And what do you think? Eleanor asked, lifting her chin. Killian was quiet for a moment, studying her with those sharp eyes. Eleanor had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing far more than she wanted to show, reading things in her face and bearing that she kept carefully hidden from most people. I think, he said slowly, that a woman who rides a mule all the way from Missouri because she picked the animal herself and trusts her own judgment over everyone else's opinions is probably stubborn enough to do just about anything she sets her mind to. Eleanor blinked, surprised despite herself. How did you know about Missouri? Your mule's got shoes from a blacksmith in Independence. I recognize the work. And your saddle's got dust from the plains, the kind that doesn't come off easy. He paused, then added, I also think a woman who files a claim on rough country without even asking about water rights or soil quality either knows exactly what she's doing or she's desperate enough that it doesn't matter. Maybe both, Eleanor said quietly. Killian nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. The land you claimed has a spring on it, small one, but it runs year-round. Mackenzie found it about 10 years back, but he never did anything with the property before he moved on. You'll find it about 100 yards west of where the aspens start growing thick. Eleanor's heart leaped. She'd been worried about water, though she'd never have admitted it to the smug clerk at the land office. Thank you. That's kind of you to tell me. Not kind, Killian said, just practical. If you're going to be my neighbor, I'd rather you didn't die of thirst and bring the law poking around asking questions. Neighborly, then, Eleanor said dryly. If you want to call it that. Killian shifted, and Eleanor realized he was carrying a heavy pack loaded with supplies. Word of advice, since you're new to these parts. Don't try to clear land by yourself. The foothills look gentle, but there are rocks under that soil that'll break your back trying to move them. Start small, just a garden plot and some grazing for your mule. You can expand later once you've proved up your claim. I appreciate the advice, Eleanor said, meaning it. Whatever else Killian Lawson might be, he clearly knew the land. Though I'm curious why you're giving it. Most of the men in this town seem to think I'll fail, and they're enjoying the prospect. Most of the men in this town are fools, Killian said bluntly. They see a woman and assume weakness. I see someone who's traveled 3 months alone through country that kills grown men every year. That takes strength and smarts. Seems wasteful to let either go to ruin just because folks are too stubborn to see past their own noses. Eleanor found herself smiling despite her usual caution. You have a gift for blunt speaking, Mr. Lawson. Mountain living doesn't leave much room for pretty words, he replied. You say what you mean or people die. What is it you do up in those mountains? Eleanor asked, curious despite herself. Trap mostly during the winter, hunt year-round. I've got a cabin that stood for 15 years, a good water source, and enough land to keep me fed. I sell furs and meat to the miners in the town, and I prefer my own company to most folks. Most folks, Eleanor echoed. Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of Killian's mouth. Some are less irritating than others. Before Eleanor could respond, the storekeeper called out, You want those supplies or not, Lawson? I've got other customers waiting. Keep your shirt on, Henderson, Killian called back. He touched the brim of his hat in Eleanor's direction, a gesture that seemed oddly formal coming from a mountain man. "Good luck with your claim, Miss Vance. If you need anything, my cabin's up Bear Creek Canyon. Follow the north trail until you hit the split, then take the eastern fork. Anyone around here can give you better directions if you need them." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and meant it, "though I hope I won't need to trouble you." "It wouldn't be trouble," Killian said simply. And then he was moving past her, his pack shifting easily on his broad shoulders as he headed to the counter. Eleanor finished gathering her own supplies, acutely aware of Killian's presence even across the store. She told herself it was simply because he was hard to miss, a man that size and that self-assured. It had nothing to do with the way his eyes had softened when he'd spoken to her, or the careful way he'd offered help without making her feel small or incapable. She loaded her supplies onto Daisy's sturdy back, the mule accepting the burden with patient resignation. As Eleanor led her animal out of town, she could feel eyes watching from every window and doorway. Let them watch. Let them whisper and bet and laugh. She'd prove every single one of them wrong. The ride back to her claim took 2 hours, following a narrow trail that wound up into the foothills through pine and oak. The air grew cooler as she climbed, and Eleanor felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. She'd never been comfortable in towns, with all their noise and people and judgment. Give her open sky and quiet any day. Her cabin, such as it was, sat in a small clearing surrounded by pines. Eleanor had chosen the spot carefully, looking for level ground with good drainage and protection from the wind. The structure she'd built was rough but solid, just one room with a dirt floor and walls made of logs she'd cut and hauled herself. The roof was pine boughs covered with canvas from her wagon. It would need to be replaced with proper shingles before winter, but it kept the rain out for now. She unloaded Daisy and turned the mule loose to graze in the clearing. There was good grass here, and Eleanor had already started building a small corral for when she needed to keep Daisy contained. Tomorrow she'd start looking for that spring Killian had mentioned. If it was really there, if it really ran year-round, then she had a chance. A real chance. Eleanor spent the rest of the afternoon working on her cabin, using the new hinges to hang the door properly. It was slow, careful work, and her hands were sore by the time the sun started sinking toward the mountains. She made herself a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, eating outside while she watched the sky turn gold and orange and finally deep purple. This was hers. This land, this cabin, this life. She'd carved it out of wilderness and determination, and no one could take it from her as long as she met the terms of her claim. The thought made her chest tight with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. Maybe both. She thought about Killian Lawson as she banked her fire for the night, a mountain man who trapped and hunted and lived alone by choice, a man who'd looked at her and seen strength instead of presumption, a man with gray eyes and careful hands and a blunt way of speaking that she'd found unexpectedly refreshing. Eleanor shook her head, dismissing the thoughts. She hadn't come all this way to moon over some man like a foolish girl. She'd come to build a life on her own terms, to prove that she could survive and thrive without depending on anyone else. Romance and attachment were luxuries she couldn't afford, not when every day was a fight to make this claim work. She fell asleep to the sound of wind in the pines and woke to birdsong and gray dawn light filtering through the gaps in her walls. There was work to do. There was always work to do. Eleanor spent the next 3 days searching for the spring Killian had mentioned, and she was beginning to think he'd been mistaken when she finally found it on the 4th morning. It was exactly where he'd said it would be, tucked into a fold of land where the aspens grew thick and green. Water bubbled up from between rocks, forming a small pool before trickling away down the hill. Eleanor knelt beside it, cupped her hands, and drank. The water was cold and clean, tasting of minerals and stone. She sat back on her heels, feeling something tight in her chest release. Water meant everything. Water meant she could plant a garden, keep chickens, maybe even a cow eventually. Water meant survival. She spent the rest of the day clearing a path from the spring to her cabin, marking it with stones so she could find it easily even in the dark. It was hard work in the June heat, and by the time she finished, her dress was soaked with sweat and her hands were blistered. But she'd done it. One more piece of her claim falling into place. 2 weeks passed in a blur of work. Eleanor cleared a garden plot, hauling rocks until her back screamed and her arms shook. She planted seeds she'd carried carefully from Missouri, beans and squash and corn that might not thrive in this new soil but deserved a chance to try. She worked on her cabin, chinked the gaps between logs with mud and moss, started building a proper fireplace from river stones. She saw no one in all that time except Daisy and the occasional deer. It should have felt lonely, but Eleanor found it peaceful instead. No one to judge her, no one to tell her she was doing things wrong. Just her and the land and the work of her own hands. She was hauling water from the spring on a hot afternoon in early July when she heard voices coming up the trail. Eleanor froze, her hand moving automatically to the rifle she'd started carrying whenever she left the cabin. She'd heard stories about bandits and hostile Indians, though she'd seen no sign of either since arriving. 3 men emerged from the trees, and Eleanor recognized them immediately from town. Miners by the look of their clothes and tools. They stopped when they saw her, and something about the way they spread out, blocking the trail, made Eleanor's instincts scream danger. "Well now," said the tallest one, a man with a scarred face and mean eyes, "if it isn't the lady homesteader. Thought we'd come see how you were getting along up here all by yourself." "I'm getting along fine," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady. "Thank you for your concern. Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." "Now that's not very friendly," said another man, shorter but broader, with hands like slabs of beef. "We came all this way to check on you, and you're going to send us away without even offering us a drink of water?" "The creek's a 1/4 mile back down the trail," Eleanor said. "Help yourselves." The third man, thin and nervous-looking, laughed. "She's got spirit. I'll give her that. But spirit doesn't mean much when you're a woman alone in the wilderness. You really think you can make this claim work? You'll be running back to town before the first snow, guaranteed." "Then I suppose you'll have wasted a trip up here," Eleanor replied. Her hand tightened on her rifle, though she kept it pointed at the ground. These men weren't here to help, that much was clear. But she couldn't quite figure out what they did want. The scarred man took a step closer. "See, here's the thing. A few of us have been watching this land for a while, waiting for the right moment to claim it ourselves. That spring you found, that's valuable. Real valuable. And it seems a shame to let it go to waste on someone who's just going to fail anyway." Understanding hit Eleanor like a punch to the gut. They wanted her land. Or more specifically, they wanted her to fail so they could claim it for themselves. "I'm not going to fail," she said flatly. "And I'm not going to be scared off by threats, so you can turn around and head back to town or we can have a problem." The scarred man smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "You're going to threaten us? You, one woman with a rifle that probably isn't even loaded?" Eleanor raised the rifle in one smooth motion, aimed it at a pine cone hanging from a branch 20 feet away, and fired. The cone exploded into fragments. She worked the lever action, chambering another round, and pointed the rifle at the scarred man's chest. "It's loaded," she said quietly, "and I'm a very good shot. My father taught me when I was 8 years old, and I've been practicing ever since. Now I'm going to say this one more time. Get off my land." The 3 men exchanged glances. The nervous one was already backing away, his hands raised. The broad one looked uncertain. But the scarred man's face darkened with anger. "You can't watch your back every second," he said. "Accidents happen out here all the time. Fires, mostly. Cabin fires. Such a shame when they happen." "Are you threatening to burn down my home?" Eleanor asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I'm just stating facts," the scarred man replied. "Cabins burn. Women get hurt. Maybe you should think about that before you get too comfortable here. And maybe you should think about what happens to men who threaten women," said a new voice, deep and cold as winter ice. All 4 of them spun around. Killian Lawson stood at the edge of the clearing, and Eleanor's heart leaped at the sight of him. He'd appeared as silently as a ghost, and he looked like something out of a legend. His rifle was in his hands, held with casual competence, and his gray eyes were fixed on the 3 miners with an expression that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "Ah, Lawson," the scarred man said, and Eleanor heard fear beneath the bravado. "This isn't your concern." "You're on land that borders mine, threatening my neighbor," Killian said, his voice still that same cold, level tone. "That makes it my concern. Now, I'm going to give you boys a choice. You can leave right now and never come back, or I can start explaining to the sheriff in town why 3 men went missing in the mountains. Your choice." "You can't threaten us," the broad man blustered. "There's 3 of us and only 1 of you." Killian smiled, and it was the most frightening expression Eleanor had ever seen. "I've lived in these mountains for 15 years. I know every trail, every hiding spot, every place where a body could disappear and never be found. I've killed bears and mountain lions and men who were stupider than you're being right now. You think I'm worried about odds?" The nervous man was already running, crashing through the brush in his haste to get away. The broad man hesitated, then followed. The scarred man stood his ground for another moment, but whatever he saw in Killian's face made him back down. "This isn't over," he said, trying to salvage some dignity. "Yes, it is," Killian replied. "Because if I see you anywhere near this claim again, I'll assume you're here to cause harm, and I'll respond accordingly. And trust me, you don't want that." The scarred man turned and practically ran down the trail. Killian watched him go, his rifle still ready, until the sounds of their retreat faded completely. Only then did he lower his weapon and turn to Eleanor. "You all right?" he asked, and his voice had changed completely, gone from cold threat to genuine concern in a heartbeat. Eleanor realized she was shaking. The rifle in her hands felt suddenly heavy, and she lowered it carefully. "I'm fine. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't arrived." "You were handling yourself pretty well," Killian said, and Eleanor thought she detected approval in his tone. "That was a good shot." "My father believed women should know how to defend themselves," Eleanor said. Her voice only shook a little. "He taught me to shoot when I was young." "Smart man." Killian moved closer, and Eleanor was struck again by his sheer size. He had to be close to 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his shirt. His arms were corded with muscle, and there was a power in the way he moved that suggested strength held carefully in check. "Those men won't bother you again, but you should be careful. Word will get around town about what happened here, and some folks might not take kindly to me interfering." "Why did you?" Eleanor asked. "Interfere, I mean. You said yourself you prefer your own company." Killian was quiet for a long moment, those gray eyes studying her face. "Let's just say I don't care for men who threaten women. And I meant what I said about neighbors. The mountains are hard enough without turning on the few people trying to make an honest living out here." "Is that all?" Eleanor asked, and she wasn't sure why she was pushing, wasn't sure what answer she wanted. Something flickered in Killian's expression, there and gone too fast to read. What else would there be? Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it again. She didn't know how to answer that question, didn't know how to explain the way her heart had leapt when she'd seen him standing there, solid and real and safe. Didn't know how to put into words the relief she'd felt, or the way something in her chest had settled when he'd appeared. "Thank you," she said instead, "for helping, for being here." "You're welcome." Killian glanced around the clearing, taking in the cabin and the garden plot and the neat stacks of firewood Eleanor had been accumulating. "You've done good work here, better than I expected, if I'm being honest." "Because I'm a woman?" Eleanor asked, a familiar defensiveness creeping into her voice. "Because anyone would have struggled to do this much in 3 weeks, man or woman," Killian replied. "You've got a good eye for land and you work hard. That matters more than anything else out here." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at the praise. It shouldn't matter what this mountain man thought of her work, but somehow it did. "I found the spring," she said. "Just where you said it would be. Thank you for that. Like I said, it seemed wasteful to let you die of thirst." But there was something in his voice that suggested he was joking, or close to it. "Would you like some coffee?" Eleanor asked impulsively. "It's the least I can offer after you rescued me from those men." "I didn't rescue you," Killian said firmly. "You had the situation under control. I just provided additional encouragement for them to leave." "Coffee," Eleanor repeated, smiling despite herself. Killian hesitated, and Eleanor thought he might refuse, but then he nodded slowly. "Coffee would be good, thank you." Eleanor led him to the cabin, suddenly acutely aware of how rough her home must look to outside eyes, but Killian didn't seem to judge. He settled himself on a stump outside, while Eleanor built up her fire and set her battered coffee pot to boil. He sat with his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the tree line with the automatic watchfulness of someone who'd lived wild for a long time. "How often do you come down from your cabin?" Eleanor asked as she measured out precious coffee grounds. Once a month, usually. Sometimes less if the weather's bad or I don't need supplies. Killian shifted, the stump creaking under his weight. I was on my way back from town when I heard voices on your trail. Recognized those men from their horses tied at the bottom of the hill. Figured they weren't up here for any good reason. Lucky for me, Eleanor said softly. Luck had nothing to do with it. I was keeping an ear out. Killian paused, then added, The mountains have a way of carrying sound. I can hear trouble coming from a mile away if I'm paying attention. And you were paying attention to my land specifically? Eleanor asked, curious. Like I said, you're my neighbor. And those men have a reputation in town for causing problems. Seemed wise to make sure they didn't cause problems for you. The coffee boiled, and Eleanor poured 2 cups, handing one to Killian. Their fingers brushed in the transfer, and Eleanor felt a jolt of something that had nothing to do with the heat of the cup. Killian's hands were huge, scarred and calloused, but his touch was careful, gentle. They drank in companionable silence for a while, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of a hawk. Eleanor found herself studying Killian when she thought he wasn't looking, taking in the details she'd missed before. The way his hair curled at his collar, dark brown shot through with threads of gray at the temples. The lines around his eyes that suggested he was older than she'd first thought, maybe in his early 30s. The old scar that ran along his jaw, white against his tanned skin. How long have you been up in these mountains? Eleanor asked. 15 years, give or take. I came out here after the war, didn't want to go back to what I'd left behind. Killian's voice was distant, and Eleanor knew better than to push for details about the war. Too many men carried scars from those years, scars that went deeper than flesh. Built my cabin, learned the land, and found that I preferred trees to people. Most people anyway, Eleanor said, echoing his earlier words. Killian's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Most people. Do you ever get lonely? The question slipped out before Eleanor could stop it, and she felt her face heat. I'm sorry, that's too personal. No, it's a fair question. Killian considered it, staring into his coffee cup. Sometimes. But I've learned that being alone is better than being with people who make you feel more alone anyway. Out here, the solitude is honest. There's peace in that. Eleanor understood that better than she could say. She'd felt more alone in her marriage than she'd ever felt in the wilderness. Your husband, Killian said carefully. You said he died 2 years ago. Was it sudden? Eleanor's throat tightened. She never talked about James, about the slow descent from hope to disappointment to quiet desperation. But something about the way Killian asked, gentle and genuinely curious rather than prying, made the words come easier. Cholera, she said. It swept through our town in Missouri. He was sick for 3 days before he died. My father went 6 months later, same disease. She took a sip of coffee, using the moment to steady herself. After that, there was nothing left for me there, just memories and a small inheritance that was barely enough to buy passage west. So you came out here to start over, Killian said. It wasn't a question. I came out here to build something that was mine, Eleanor corrected. Something no one could take from me or control. I've spent my whole life doing what other people expected, being what other people wanted. The claim, this cabin, it's the first thing I've ever done just for myself. Then I hope you make it work, Killian said, and there was something fierce in his voice that made Eleanor look up sharply. I hope you prove every single person in that town wrong. That seems to be my plan, Eleanor said with a small smile. They finished their coffee, and Killian stood, stretching like a big cat. Eleanor's eyes caught on the way his muscles shifted under his shirt, the sheer physical power in his frame, and she quickly looked away, embarrassed by her own reaction. I should get back to my own place, Killian said, but I meant what I offered before. If you need help with anything, my cabin's up Bear Creek Canyon, and I'll be keeping an ear out for trouble. I appreciate that, Eleanor said, walking with him to the edge of the clearing where the trail began, though I hope I won't need to impose on your solitude. Like I said, it wouldn't be an imposition. Killian paused, seeming to wrestle with something. Then he said, I'll be coming back this way in about a week. I thought I might check on you, make sure those miners are keeping their distance, if that's all right with you. Eleanor's heart did something complicated in her chest. That would be all right, she said softly. More than all right. Killian nodded, something that might have been relief crossing his face. Then he touched his hat brim in that same oddly formal gesture and disappeared into the trees, moving with the silent grace of someone who knew the wilderness as well as his own heartbeat. Eleanor stood in the clearing long after he'd gone, one hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating too fast. She told herself it was just the aftermath of fear from the confrontation with the miners, just gratitude for Killian's help, just appreciation for a neighbor who'd proven himself trustworthy. But deep down, in a place she wasn't quite ready to examine too closely, Eleanor knew it was more than that. And that terrified her almost as much as those 3 miners had. The week that followed was the longest of Eleanor's life. She threw herself into work with almost desperate intensity, clearing more land for her garden, building a proper chicken coop even though she didn't have chickens yet, reinforcing the walls of her cabin. Every time she caught herself listening for footsteps on the trail or looking toward the trees hoping to see a tall figure emerge, she forced herself back to whatever task was at hand. She was being foolish. Killian Lawson was a neighbor, nothing more. A helpful neighbor who'd made it clear he preferred solitude and had only offered to check on her out of common decency. The fact that she couldn't stop thinking about his gray eyes or the careful way he'd touched her hand or the protective fury in his voice when he'd confronted those miners meant nothing. Eleanor had been married. She knew what lay between men and women, the disappointing reality versus the romantic stories. James had been kind enough, but there had been no passion, no connection deeper than basic companionship. She'd learned not to expect more, not to hope for the kind of love the poets wrote about. But then Killian appeared in her clearing exactly 7 days after his last visit, and Eleanor's heart leaped so violently that she nearly dropped the axe she'd been using to split firewood. "Afternoon," Killian called, raising one hand in greeting. "Thought I'd see how you were getting along." "Well enough," Eleanor managed, trying to ignore how her voice sounded breathless. She set the axe down and wiped her sweating face with her sleeve. "No trouble from those miners or anyone else?" "Good." Killian moved closer, his eyes taking in the work she had accomplished. "You've been busy. That's a fine-looking chicken coop." "Thank you. I'm hoping to buy some hens when I go to town next week." Eleanor gestured toward the cabin. "Would you like some water? Coffee?" "Water would be good, thank you." Eleanor led him to the spring, grateful for the excuse to move, to have something to do with her hands. Killian knelt beside the pool and drank deeply, then splashed water over his face and neck. Eleanor tried very hard not to notice the way droplets caught in his hair, or the way the water darkened his shirt collar. "This is a good spring," Killian said, sitting back. "Better than mine, actually. The water's colder, which means it's coming from deeper. Won't dry up even in a bad drought." "That's good to know." Eleanor settled herself on a rock, keeping a careful distance between them. "I've been thinking about maybe planting fruit trees near here, apple or pear, something that doesn't need too much attention." "Apples would do well," Killian agreed. "The altitude's right for them, and they're hardy, though you'll need to protect them from deer." They talked about farming and gardening and the challenges of mountain living, and Eleanor found herself relaxing into the conversation. Killian knew so much about the land, and he shared his knowledge freely, without condescension or expectation of payment. He treated her like an equal, like someone whose intelligence and capability he respected. "I brought you something," Killian said after a while, reaching into the pack he'd set aside. He pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and handed it to Eleanor. She unwrapped it carefully and found herself holding several packets of seeds. "Oh," she breathed, recognizing varieties she hadn't been able to afford in town. Carrots, turnips, lettuce, even some herb seeds. "I've been saving them for a few years," Killian explained, "but I've got more than I need, and I thought you might have use for them. That garden plot you cleared is big enough for plenty." Eleanor looked up, feeling something warm and dangerous bloom in her chest. "This is too generous. These seeds cost money. I didn't pay for them. I saved them from my own crops." Killian shifted, looking almost uncomfortable. "It's just practical. The more food you can grow yourself, the less you have to buy in town, and the less you have to go to town, the safer you are from men like those miners." "Still," Eleanor said softly, "thank you. This means more than you probably realize." They looked at each other for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something in Killian's eyes that made her breath catch. Heat and longing and something careful, something held back with visible effort. Then Killian looked away, breaking the moment. I should probably get going. Lots of ground to cover before dark. Of course, Eleanor said, trying to ignore the disappointment that crashed through her. Thank you again for the seeds and for checking on me. Killian stood, shouldering his pack. I'll be back this way in another week or so, if that's all right. It's all right, Eleanor said, meeting his eyes. More than all right. Killian nodded, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might say something else, but he just touched his hat and turned toward the trail, leaving her standing by the spring with a bundle of seeds and a heart full of feelings she didn't quite know how to name. The pattern continued through the rest of July and into August. Killian would appear every week or so, always with some excuse about checking on her safety or bringing her something useful. Seeds, tools, a smoked haunch of venison when her own hunting proved unsuccessful. Eleanor would offer him coffee or water or share whatever meal she'd prepared, and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing. Eleanor learned that Killian had been a soldier during the war, though he never spoke about it directly. She learned that he'd grown up in Pennsylvania, the youngest of 5 brothers, and that he'd headed west as soon as the fighting ended. She learned that he could identify 100 different plants and their uses, that he could track a deer for miles without losing the trail, that he'd once killed a mountain lion that had been stalking his cabin. Killian learned that Eleanor had been educated beyond what was common for women, that her father had believed knowledge was never wasted regardless of gender. He learned that she'd been married at 18 to a man her father had chosen, that the marriage had been pleasant enough but devoid of real affection. He learned that she had a quick wit and a stubborn streak a mile wide, and that she could work from sunup to sundown without complaint. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other in ways that had nothing to do with words. Eleanor learned that Killian always checked her cabin and clearing for signs of danger before he let himself relax. She learned that he never touched her without permission, but that his eyes followed her movements with an intensity that made her skin tingle. She learned that he smiled rarely but genuinely, and that when he did, it transformed his whole face. Killian learned that Eleanor hummed when she worked, wordless tunes that drifted through the clearing. He learned that she had a habit of pushing stray hair behind her ear when she was thinking hard about something. He learned that she was lonely, though she'd never admit it, and that she lit up like sunrise whenever he appeared on the trail. Neither of them spoke about what was growing between them. It felt too new, too fragile, too dangerous to put into words. But it was there all the same, building with every visit, every shared coffee, every moment their eyes met and held. It was mid-August when things finally came to a head. Eleanor had been working in her garden, pulling weeds in the afternoon heat, when she heard Daisy bray a warning. She looked up to see Killian striding into the clearing, and her heart sank when she saw his expression. He looked furious. What's wrong?" Eleanor asked, scrambling to her feet. "I was in town today," Killian said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Heard some talk about you. Those miners, the ones who threatened you, they've been spreading stories, saying you invited them up here, that you're running some kind of establishment for men with money." Eleanor felt cold fury wash through her. "They're lying." "I know they're lying," Killian said. "Everyone with half a brain knows they're lying, but mud sticks, especially when it's flung at a woman living alone. I confronted them, told them to shut their mouths or I'd shut it for them." "What happened?" Eleanor asked, though she could guess from the fresh bruise forming on Killian's jaw. "We had a disagreement that turned physical," Killian said grimly. "Sheriff broke it up before anyone got seriously hurt, but those men know now that I'm watching. If they spread any more lies about you, they'll answer to me." Eleanor's hands were shaking with anger and something else, something that felt dangerously close to tenderness. "You shouldn't have done that. You could have been arrested." "I don't care," Killian said flatly. "I won't stand by and let them ruin your reputation with lies." "Why?" Eleanor demanded, the word bursting out of her. "Why do you care so much? You barely know me. I'm just some woman who filed a claim near yours. You don't owe me anything." Killian stared at her, his chest heaving, and Eleanor saw the moment his control finally snapped. "Because I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice raw. "Because I spend every day counting the hours until I can see you again. Because the thought of anyone hurting you or driving you away makes me want to burn the whole damn town to the ground." Eleanor's breath caught. "Killian." "I know I shouldn't feel this way," Killian continued, the words pouring out like he couldn't stop them. "I know you came here to be independent, to build your own life. I know you don't need some mountain man complicating things, but God help me, Eleanor. I'm falling in love with you and I don't know how to stop." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear over the rush of blood in her ears. "What if I don't want you to stop?" she whispered. Killian went very still. "What?" "I said," Eleanor repeated, her voice stronger now. "What if I don't want you to stop? What if I've been waiting every week for you to visit? What if I've been feeling the same things you have and been too afraid to say anything?" Killian closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped just inches from her, close enough that Eleanor could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the silver flecks in his gray eyes. "Tell me," he said, his voice almost a growl. "Tell me I'm not imagining this." "You're not imagining it," Eleanor breathed. "I feel it too, this connection, this pull. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself I was being foolish. But Killian, I can't stop thinking about you either." Killian's hand came up slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away. When she didn't, his palm cupped her cheek with infinite gentleness, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I'm not good at pretty words," he said roughly. "I'm not refined or educated or anything you probably should want. But I swear to you, Eleanor, if you give me a chance, I will protect you and provide for you and cherish you for as long as I'm breathing." "I don't want refined," Eleanor said, her hand coming up to cover his. "I had refined. I had proper and educated and suitable. None of it mattered because there was no feeling behind it. You, Killian Lawson, you make me feel alive for the first time in my life. You make me feel seen and valued and strong. That's worth more than all the refinement in the world." Killian's other hand came up to frame her face, and he leaned down slowly, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. Eleanor rose up on her toes, closing the final distance between them, and their lips met. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if Killian was afraid of his own strength. But when Eleanor sighed against his mouth and pressed closer, something in him seemed to break. His arms came around her, pulling her tight against his broad chest, and the kiss deepened into something that made Eleanor's toes curl in her boots. She'd never been kissed like this, with such passion and hunger and tenderness all mixed together. Her hands fisted in Killian's shirt, holding on as the world seemed to spin around them. His mouth was hot and demanding, but his hands were careful where they pressed against her back, supporting her weight as if she were something precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Killian rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Only weeks?" Eleanor asked, slightly breathless. "I've wanted it since the first time you appeared in that general store and told me I looked stubborn." Killian laughed, a real laugh that Eleanor had never heard from him before. It was a wonderful sound, rich and genuine. "I knew then you were going to be trouble," he said. "I just didn't know what kind." "The best kind, I hope," Eleanor said with a smile. "Definitely the best kind." Killian kissed her again, softer this time, sweet and lingering. Then he pulled back, his expression turning serious. "Eleanor, I meant what I said. I'm falling in love with you. Hell, I might already be there. But I need you to understand what that means. I'm a mountain man. I live rough and I'm gone for days sometimes when I'm trapping. I don't have much in the way of money or social standing. All I can offer you is myself and everything I am." "That's all I want," Eleanor said firmly. "I didn't come out here looking for money or standing. I came looking for freedom and a life I could be proud of. And somehow, impossibly, I found you. If you think I'm going to let you go now, you're wrong." "Stubborn," Killian said, but there was such warmth in his voice that it felt like the highest compliment. "You picked me," Eleanor reminded him. "You don't get to complain about stubborn." "I'm not complaining," Killian assured her. "I'm just acknowledging a fact." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her skin. "So what do we do now?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "I've never done this before. Courted someone I actually chose for myself." "Neither have I," Killian said. "I've never wanted anyone enough to try." They looked at each other, and Eleanor felt laughter bubbling up in her chest. Here they were, two people who'd sworn off companionship, who'd built their lives around independence and solitude, completely at a loss about how to move forward together. "Maybe we just keep doing what we've been doing," Eleanor suggested. "You visit, we talk, we get to know each other, except now we can do this too." She rose up and kissed him again, just because she could. Killian made a sound low in his throat that did interesting things to Eleanor's insides. "I like that plan," he said when they parted, "though I'm going to have a hard time leaving now." "Then don't," Eleanor said impulsively. "Stay for dinner. Stay and talk with me until the stars come out. You don't have to rush back to your cabin tonight, do you?" "No," Killian said slowly. "I don't have to rush back." They spent the evening together, and it felt like something out of a dream. Eleanor cooked dinner while Killian chopped more firewood, his axe ringing through the clearing. They ate together as the sun set, talking and laughing and occasionally falling into comfortable silence. When full darkness fell, Killian built up the fire, and they sat beside it, Eleanor leaning back against Killian's broad chest while his arms wrapped around her. "I could get used to this," Eleanor murmured, feeling more content than she could remember being in years. "So could I," Killian said, his chin resting on top of her head. "Though people in town are going to talk even more if they find out about us." "Let them talk," Eleanor said. "They were already talking. At least now there's a reason for it." Killian's arms tightened around her. "You sure about this? About me? Because once word gets out, there's no taking it back. You'll be tied to the mountain man who lives like a hermit and fights in town." "I'm sure," Eleanor said, twisting in his arms so she could see his face. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Killian kissed her again, long and slow, and Eleanor felt like she was finally home. He left before dawn, heading back to his own cabin with promises to return in a few days. Eleanor watched him disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, one hand pressed to her lips where she could still feel the ghost of his kisses. The next 2 months passed in a blur of happiness. Killian visited as often as he could, sometimes staying for a few hours, sometimes for a whole day. He helped Eleanor finish her cabin, adding proper roof shingles and a stone fireplace. He taught her more about hunting and tracking, about reading the weather and predicting the seasons. And he courted her with a sweetness that made Eleanor's heart ache, bringing her wildflowers and interesting stones, fixing things around her claim without being asked, sitting with her in the evenings while she read aloud from her small collection of books. Eleanor fell more in love with him every day. She loved his quiet strength and the way he listened when she talked. She loved how he treated her like an equal partner, asking her opinion and respecting her decisions. She loved the way he kissed her, with passion tempered by gentleness, and the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. By October, when the aspens turned gold and the nights grew cold, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with this man. Killian came to her cabin on a crisp autumn afternoon, and Eleanor knew immediately that something was different. He looked nervous, which was unusual for a man who faced down bears without flinching. "I need to talk to you," he said, and Eleanor's heart stuttered with sudden fear. "All right," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Killian said quickly. Then he shook his head. "That's not true. Everything might be wrong, depending on how you answer what I'm about to ask." Eleanor waited, her hands clenched in her lap. Killian took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee in front of her. Eleanor's breath caught as he pulled a small object from his pocket. It was a ring, carved from what looked like mountain sheep horn, polished smooth and beautiful. "I made this myself," Killian said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's not gold or silver, and there's no jewels. But it's strong and it'll last, and I thought maybe that was worth more than something expensive that might break." "Killian," Eleanor whispered, tears already streaming down her face. "Eleanor Vance, I love you," Killian continued. "I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you hum when you're working. I love how you never back down from a challenge and how you treat that ornery mule of yours with more patience than most people show their children. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Eleanor said, the word coming out as almost a sob. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." Killian slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Then he stood and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around, while she laughed and cried at the same time. "I was so nervous," Killian admitted, setting her down but not releasing her. "I thought you might say no, that you might want to keep your independence." "I'll still have my independence," Eleanor said, cupping his face in her hands. "That's the beautiful thing, Killian. You don't try to control me or change me. You just love me as I am. That's not losing independence, that's gaining a partner." Killian kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Eleanor felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony in Grass Valley. The preacher looked skeptical about the match, but he performed the service without comment. Eleanor wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself, and Killian wore his cleanest shirt with his hair tied back. There were no guests except for a few curious townspeople who'd heard about the wedding, and Eleanor didn't care one bit. What mattered was the way Killian's voice shook when he said his vows. What mattered was the fierce tenderness in his eyes when he slipped a second ring onto her finger, this one made of silver he'd traded furs for in town. What mattered was the kiss they shared afterward, witnessed by a setting sun that painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They spent their wedding night in Eleanor's cabin, which had become so much more than just shelter over the past months. Killian built up the fire while Eleanor changed into her nightgown, suddenly nervous despite all the kisses they'd shared, all the feelings they'd declared. When she emerged from behind the curtain she'd hung for privacy, Killian was waiting by the fire. He'd removed his shirt, and Eleanor's mouth went dry at the sight of him. She'd known he was muscular, had felt the strength in his arms when he held her, but seeing him like this was different. His chest was broad and heavily muscled, marked with old scars that spoke of a hard life. His arms were like tree trunks, corded with power. "You're beautiful," Killian said softly, and Eleanor realized he was looking at her with the same awe she felt looking at him. "So are you," Eleanor whispered. Killian crossed to her, moving slowly like he was afraid of frightening her. His hands were gentle as they cupped her face, tilting her head up for a kiss that started soft and grew heated. Eleanor's hands explored his bare chest, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady beat of his heart under her palm. "Are you sure about this?" Killian asked, his voice rough with desire but his eyes serious. "We can wait if you're not ready." "I'm sure," Eleanor said. "I've never been more ready for anything." Killian picked her up as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the bed she'd built months ago. And there, with the firelight flickering across the cabin walls and the wind singing through the pines outside, they came together with a passion and tenderness that made Eleanor's previous marriage seem like a pale shadow of what love could be. Killian was careful with her, mindful of his strength, making sure she felt cherished and desired in equal measure. And when Eleanor finally fell asleep in his arms, feeling safer and more loved than she'd ever imagined possible, she knew she'd made exactly the right choice. The winter that followed was hard, as mountain winters always are. Snow fell heavy and deep, and there were days when Eleanor couldn't see past the clearing. But she and Killian weathered it together, warm in their cabin with plenty of supplies laid in. They spent the long, dark evenings talking and reading and making love, learning each other's bodies and hearts with patient thoroughness. Killian taught Eleanor how to tan hides and make candles from animal fat. Eleanor taught Killian how to read better, working through her books with him until he could manage even the difficult passages. They were partners in every sense of the word, working together to survive and thrive in the harsh mountain environment. By the time spring arrived, melting the snow and bringing the first green shoots pushing through the earth, Eleanor knew she was pregnant. She waited to tell Killian until she was sure, and then she chose a morning when the sun was particularly bright and the birds were singing with joy at the changing season. "I have something to tell you," she said as they worked together in the garden, preparing the soil for planting. Killian looked up from where he was turning earth. "What is it?" "We're going to have a baby," Eleanor said, watching his face carefully. "Sometime in the fall, I think." Killian's expression went through several changes in rapid succession. Shock, then joy, then fear, then fierce protectiveness. He dropped his spade and crossed to her in 3 long strides, pulling her into his arms. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently. "Do you feel well? Should you be working in the garden? Maybe you should rest." Eleanor laughed, delighted by his reaction. "I'm fine, Killian. Pregnancy isn't an illness. Women work through it all the time." "Not my wife," Killian said firmly. "Not if I can help it. You should be taking it easy, not hauling rocks and digging in dirt." "Killian," Eleanor said gently, cupping his face, "I appreciate your concern truly, but I'm strong and healthy, and I'm not going to spend the next 6 months sitting idle. I promise I'll be careful and I'll ask for help when I need it. But you have to trust me to know my own body." Killian struggled visibly with this, his protective instincts warring with his respect for her judgment. Finally, he nodded. "All right." But if you feel tired or unwell, you tell me immediately, and I'm doing all the heavy work from now on." "That seems fair," Eleanor agreed, rising up to kiss him. "You're going to be a wonderful father." "I'm going to try," Killian said, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "God, Eleanor, we're going to have a child." "We are," Eleanor confirmed, feeling tears of happiness prick her eyes. "Are you happy about it?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Killian said roughly. "Terrified, yes, but happy beyond measure?" The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months. Eleanor's belly grew round, and Killian became even more protective than before, insisting on doing work he'd previously let her help with. Eleanor let him fuss over her, understanding that it came from love rather than a desire to control. They prepared for the baby's arrival together, Killian building a cradle from smooth pine and Eleanor sewing tiny clothes from soft fabric she'd bought on one of their trips to town. The townspeople's attitude toward them had softened somewhat over the winter, especially when word got out about the baby. A pregnant woman was harder to scorn than a single homesteader, and Killian's fierce defense of Eleanor's reputation had made it clear that spreading lies would have consequences. Eleanor's labor started on a cool September evening, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Killian immediately went into a state of controlled panic, checking on her every few minutes, offering water and asking if there was anything she needed. "I need you to calm down," Eleanor said with a strained laugh as another contraction gripped her. "You're making me nervous." "Sorry," Killian said, running his hands through his hair. "I just feel helpless. Is there anything I can do?" "Be here with me," Eleanor said, reaching for his hand. "That's all I need." The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Killian stayed by Eleanor's side the entire time, letting her squeeze his hand until his fingers went numb, wiping her face with cool water, murmuring encouragement when she was sure she couldn't continue. Finally, as the sun climbed toward noon, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry that made both parents laugh with relief and joy. Killian cut the cord with shaking hands, and then Eleanor was holding their baby, counting his tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the miracle they'd created. "He's perfect," Killian said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked down at mother and child. "You're both perfect." "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked, exhausted but happier than she'd ever been. "I was thinking maybe Connor," Killian suggested. "It was my grandfather's name, but only if you like it." "Connor Lawson," Eleanor said, testing it out. "I love it. Hello, Connor. Welcome to the world." Their son blinked up at them with unfocused eyes, and Eleanor felt her heart overflow with love. She'd built a life here in these mountains, carved out a place for herself through determination and hard work. But this, holding her child with her husband beside her, this was more than she'd ever dared to dream. The first year of Connor's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and precious moments. Killian proved to be a devoted father, waking for midnight feedings, walking the floor with a crying baby, showing infinite patience with their son's needs. He fashioned toys from wood, carved animals, and simple shapes that Connor would one day play with. Eleanor recovered her strength and returned to work, though she now had help in the form of her husband and the careful routines they'd established. They worked the land together, their combined efforts making the claim more productive than Eleanor could have managed alone. The garden thrived, the chickens Eleanor had finally acquired laid eggs regularly, and they even got a cow that provided milk and butter. By the time Connor turned 1, Eleanor was pregnant again. This time, the news was met with joy rather than anxiety. They knew what to expect now, and their cabin was already set up for children. Their daughter, Kate, was born in the spring of 1874, during a rainstorm that made the cabin roof drum with water. She was smaller than Connor had been, but she had her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined chin. Killian fell in love with her instantly, this tiny girl who wrapped his calloused finger in her impossibly small hand. 2 children, Eleanor said, watching Killian cradle Kate while Connor played at his feet. "We have 2 children." "We do," Killian agreed, looking up with a smile that made Eleanor's heart skip. "Think we should go for 3? "Ask me again in a year," Eleanor said with a laugh, "when I'm not quite so exhausted." Life settled into a rhythm over the next few years. Killian continued his trapping in the winter, though he never went as far or stayed as long as he had before marriage. His family needed him, and he was always eager to return to the cabin where Eleanor and the children waited. Eleanor managed the homestead with skill and determination, proving to anyone who cared to notice that she was more than capable of working the land. They had a third child, a son they named Thomas, when Connor was 4 and Kate was 2, and then a fourth, another daughter named Sarah, 2 years after that. Their cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, Killian adding rooms with the same care he'd shown in building the cradles. The children grew up strong and capable, taught by both parents to work hard, think independently, and respect the land that provided for them. Connor had his father's size and strength, even as a young boy. Kate had her mother's stubbornness and her father's skill at tracking. Thomas was quiet and thoughtful, always watching and learning. And Sarah, the youngest, seemed to have inherited the best qualities of both parents, fierce and loving in equal measure. The townspeople of Grass Valley eventually accepted the Lawson family, won over by the children's good manners and Killian's steady reliability. When someone needed help, Killian was there. When someone was sick, Eleanor showed up with food and medicine. They became valued members of the community despite their unconventional beginning. Eleanor never did fully prove up her original homestead claim in the traditional sense. She'd married before the 5 years were complete, and technically the land became Killian's property under the law. But in practice, it remained hers. Killian never acted as if he owned what Eleanor had built, and everyone understood that the claim was Eleanor's dream, Eleanor's accomplishment. Years passed. The children grew. Connor became a skilled hunter like his father. Kate learned to ride before she could properly walk, showing the same affinity for animals that Eleanor had always had. Thomas developed a talent for working with wood, creating beautiful carvings and furniture. Sarah showed signs of having her mother's quick mind and love of learning. On a warm summer evening in 1883, Eleanor sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. Killian sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, both of them content in the comfortable silence of a long marriage. Their children were scattered around the clearing, Connor and Kate arguing good-naturedly about something, while Thomas carved, and Sarah read from one of Eleanor's treasured books. "Remember when you first came to Grass Valley?" Killian asked, his voice quiet. "When everyone said you'd fail?" "I remember," Eleanor said, leaning into his warmth. "I remember thinking I was so alone, that I had no one to rely on but myself." "You were never really alone," Killian said. "Even before I knew you, I was watching out for you. Something about you called to me from the first moment I saw you in that general store, sitting on that stubborn mule with your back straight and your eyes defiant." "They said I had a stubborn mule for a horse," Eleanor recalled with a smile. "Do you remember what you told me, that day in the store?" "I said you were someone who picked her own way," Killian replied. "And I was right. You always have, even when it led you into danger or difficulty." "It led me to you," Eleanor pointed out. "That seems like a pretty good way to go." Killian kissed the top of her head, a gesture so familiar and beloved that Eleanor's eyes prickled with tears of happiness. "Best decision I ever made was coming down that mountain to check on the woman everyone said would fail. Second best was admitting to myself that I was falling in love with you." "Only second best?" Eleanor asked teasingly. "First best was asking you to marry me," Killian clarified. "Everything good in my life comes from that one moment when you said yes." Eleanor turned to look at him. This man who'd been her partner for more than a decade, the father of her children, the love of her life. His hair was graying now, threads of silver mixing with the brown. There were more lines around his eyes, deeper creases in his weathered face. But his gray eyes were still sharp and intelligent, and the strength in his arms was undiminished. "I love you," Eleanor said simply. "More now than even on the day we married. I didn't think that was possible, but every year with you just seems to make my heart bigger." "I love you too," Killian said, "more than I have words for. You gave me a family, Eleanor, a home, a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive. I can never repay that." "You don't have to repay it," Eleanor said. "You gave me the same things, freedom and love in a partnership I never knew existed. We gave each other everything that matters." They sat together as the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Their children's voices drifted through the evening air, familiar and beloved. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and Daisy the mule answered with a sleepy bray from her corral. Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here, from Missouri to California, from widow to wife, from solitary homesteader to mother of 4. It hadn't been easy. There had been struggles and setbacks, hard winters and lean times, but every challenge had been worth it for moments like this, sitting beside the man she loved while their children played and the mountains stood eternal in the distance. "What are you thinking about?" Killian asked, always attuned to her moods. "How lucky I am," Eleanor said honestly. "How blessed. I came west looking for independence and found so much more. Found you, found this family, found a home not just in the land but in your arms." Killian pulled her closer, and Eleanor rested her head on his broad shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. This was home. Not the cabin, not the land, though she loved both. Home was wherever this man was, this family they'd built together from nothing but determination and love. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. "For what?" Killian asked. "For seeing me," Eleanor said. "For seeing past what everyone else thought I should be to who I actually was. For loving me, not despite my stubborn independence, but because of it." "You make it sound like I had a choice," Killian said with gentle humor. "From the moment I met you, I was lost. You captured my heart before I even knew I had one to give." They stayed on the porch until full dark, and then they called the children inside. Connor carried Sarah, who'd fallen asleep over her book. Kate helped Thomas put away his carving tools. They moved through the evening routine with practiced ease, this family that fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Later, when the children were all asleep in their various beds, Eleanor and Killian lay together in their own bed, the one Killian had built years ago to replace Eleanor's original rough frame. Moonlight filtered through the window, casting silver light across the room. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Giving up your solitude for this noisy, chaotic family life?" "Never," Killian said firmly. "Not for a single moment. My life before you was just existence, Eleanor. Survival. You gave me a reason to truly live." "You did the same for me," Eleanor said. She turned in his arms so she could see his face in the moonlight. "I thought I knew what I wanted when I came here. Independence, self-sufficiency, freedom, and I got all of that. But I also got love, and that turned out to be the most important thing of all." Killian kissed her, slow and sweet, and Eleanor felt the familiar spark that even years of marriage hadn't diminished. They made love quietly, mindful of the children sleeping nearby, but with a passion and tenderness that spoke of deep, abiding love. Afterward, as Eleanor drifted toward sleep in Killian's arms, she thought about how far she'd come. From the scared widow filing a land claim in a hostile town to this moment, secure and loved and surrounded by family. It was more than she'd ever dreamed possible. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and growth and the steady accumulation of small joys. Connor grew tall and strong, eventually building his own cabin on the far edge of their land when he turned 20. Kate surprised everyone by becoming interested in healing, learning about medicinal plants, and helping when anyone in the area was sick or injured. Thomas's skill with woodworking became so well known that people came from Grass Valley and beyond to commission pieces from him. And Sarah, brilliant Sarah, became the first person in the family to attend a proper school when a teacher finally came to the area. Eleanor and Killian grew older together, their bodies showing the wear of hard work and mountain living, but their love never diminishing. They remained partners in every sense, working the land side by side, raising their children with wisdom and patience, supporting each other through difficulties, and celebrating triumphs together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Killian surprised Eleanor by taking her back to the spot where they'd first kissed, beside the spring on her original claim. The aspens were gold with autumn, and the water still bubbled up clear and cold from the rocks. 20 years, Killian said, pulling Eleanor close. 20 years since I asked you to marry me, and I still wake up every morning grateful that you said yes. Only 20? Eleanor teased. Feels like I've loved you my whole life. Maybe you have, Killian said. Maybe we were always meant to find each other, even when it seemed impossible. I used to think I didn't need anyone, Eleanor admitted, that depending on someone meant weakness. But loving you taught me that partnership doesn't mean losing yourself. It means becoming more than you could be alone. Wise words from the woman who once rode a stubborn mule into town and stared down a land office clerk, Killian said with a smile. That mule taught me a valuable lesson, Eleanor replied. Sometimes the thing that everyone else sees as a flaw is actually a strength. Stubbornness kept me alive on the trail. It helped me prove up my claim, and it made me refuse to give up on love even when it seemed impossible. Thank God for that stubbornness then, Killian said, and he kissed her beside the spring where water had flowed for countless years and would flow for countless more, constant as the mountains, enduring as their love. They returned to their cabin as the sun set, walking hand in hand through the forest they knew as well as their own heartbeats. Their children and grandchildren, Connor had married and had his first child the year before, were waiting for them with a celebration dinner prepared. The cabin was full of noise and laughter and love, everything Eleanor had never known she wanted until she found it. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. Her family, her home, the life she'd built from nothing but determination and faith in herself. Killian came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and Eleanor leaned back against his solid strength. This was everything. This moment, this man, this family, this life. "Happy anniversary," Killian murmured in her ear. "Happy anniversary," Eleanor replied, turning in his arms to kiss him. "Here's to 20 more years." "Here's to forever," Killian corrected, and Eleanor smiled because that sounded exactly right. They joined their family inside, and the evening passed in warmth and joy. Stories were told, both old and new. Laughter rang through the cabin, and when Eleanor finally fell asleep that night, exhausted but happy, she dreamed of the future still to come. More years passed, bringing changes and challenges but also joy beyond measure. Eleanor and Killian became grandparents several times over as their children married and started families of their own. Their original cabin became the heart of a small family compound, with children and grandchildren building homes nearby, creating a community bound by blood and love. Eleanor's original homestead claim, the land she'd fought so hard for, remained productive and beautiful. The garden she'd started grew into an orchard and extensive vegetable plots that fed the whole family. The spring still ran clear and cold, providing water for multiple households now, and the aspens still turned gold every autumn, marking the passage of another year. On a crisp October morning in 1898, Eleanor sat on the porch she'd sat on thousands of times before. She was 70 now, her dark hair turned silver, her face lined with years of sun and wind and smiles. But her eyes were still sharp, still defiant, still full of life. Killian sat beside her, 74 now, his broad frame showing the effects of age but still strong, still steady. His gray eyes had faded a bit, but they still lit up whenever he looked at Eleanor, still showed the love that had sustained them through more than 2 decades of marriage. They watched their family scattered across the clearing, children and grandchildren, all of them healthy and thriving. Connor was teaching his eldest son to track. Kate was gathering medicinal herbs with her daughters. Thomas was showing his youngest how to carve. Sarah was reading to a group of enraptured grandchildren. "We did well," Eleanor said softly. "We did," Killian agreed. "Better than I ever imagined possible." "Do you remember what everyone said when I first came here?" Eleanor asked. "That I'd fail, that a woman couldn't make it alone in the wilderness." "I remember," Killian said, "and I remember thinking they were fools who didn't see what I saw." "What did you see?" Eleanor asked, even though she'd asked this question before, loved hearing his answer. "Strength," Killian said simply. "Determination. A woman who knew her own mind and had the courage to follow her own path. A woman who picked her own way, regardless of what anyone else thought she should do." "That woman's got a stubborn mule for a horse," they said, Eleanor recalled with a smile. "And I said she picks her own way," Killian finished. "Best decision I ever made, following that stubborn woman and her stubborn mule." Eleanor laughed, the sound still bright despite her years. "Best decision I ever made was letting you." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd built a life together from nothing but love and determination. The mountains rose eternal around them, unchanged by time. But everything else had changed, transformed by the choices they'd made and the love they'd shared. As the sun climbed higher, warming the autumn air, Eleanor reflected on her journey. She'd come to California seeking independence and found it. But she'd also found something she hadn't known she was looking for, a love that honored her strength rather than trying to diminish it, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection, a family that grew from the seeds of that love. She looked at the ring on her finger, the one Killian had carved from horn all those years ago. It was worn smooth now, shaped by decades of wear. Beside it was the silver band he'd given her on their wedding day, both ring symbols of promises kept and love sustained. "I love you," Eleanor said, not for the first time and not for the last. "I love you too," Killian replied, his voice still strong despite his years. "Always have, always will." Their children and grandchildren called them for lunch, and Eleanor and Killian stood together, supporting each other as they'd always done. They walked into the cabin surrounded by family, their hands clasped together, their hearts full. This was the life Eleanor had built, better than any she could have imagined on that hot day in June when she'd ridden into Grass Valley on a stubborn mule. She'd picked her own way, just as Killian had said, and it had led her to more joy than she'd dreamed possible. The story of Eleanor and Killian Lawson became something of a legend in Grass Valley and the surrounding mountains. People spoke of the woman who'd homesteaded alone and the mountain man who'd loved her. They spoke of stubborn determination and true partnership, of a family built on respect and affection rather than mere convenience. And years later, when Eleanor and Killian were both gone, laid to rest on a hillside overlooking the claim Eleanor had fought so hard for, their descendants continued the legacy they'd started. The land remained productive, the family remained close, and the lessons Eleanor and Killian had taught about independence, partnership, and love endured. But in their final years together, sitting on that porch while the mountains stood eternal and their family thrived around them, Eleanor and Killian knew they'd succeeded in the most important way. They'd built a life together, created a family, and proven that love honored and respected was the greatest achievement of all. They'd both picked their own way, and miraculously, impossibly, their paths had led to each other. And that made all the difference.